On June 18, 2020, Germany's most celebrated tech company ceased to exist. Not because of competition. Not because of a bad product. Because 1.9 billion euros in cash had simply never been there. Auditors at Ernst & Young had asked a routine question. Can you show us the money in your Philippine bank accounts? The banks replied they had never heard of Wirecard. Nearly 2 billion euros, gone. Except it was never gone. It had never existed at all. Within days, Wirecard's stock collapsed 98%. Billions in shareholder value, wiped out in 72 hours. Pension funds. Retail investors. Ordinary Germans who believed in their country's great tech hope. All of them destroyed by a number on a spreadsheet that someone had invented. This is the story of the biggest accounting fraud in European history. A fraud that fooled auditors, regulators, banks, and governments for nearly a decade. And the one journalist who refused to look away. But to understand how this happened, we need to go back to a payment startup in Munich. Because this story didn't start with a collapse. It started with a con so brazen it shouldn't have worked. And yet, it almost worked forever. To understand Wirecard, you need to understand what payments processing actually is. When you swipe your card at a coffee shop, someone has to move that money. From your bank to the merchant's bank. In milliseconds. Invisibly. Billions of times a day. That invisible middleman takes a small cut every single time. Do that at scale and you're printing money. Wirecard was supposed to be that middleman. Founded in Munich in 1999, it started processing payments for online gambling and adult websites. Not glamorous. But massively profitable. By the mid-2000s, it had gone public and was growing fast. Then a man named Markus Braun took over as CEO. Braun was Austrian. Quiet. Intense. Always wore a black turtleneck. The tech press called him Germany's Steve Jobs. He had a vision: Wirecard wouldn't just process payments. It would become the financial infrastructure of the entire digital economy. The pitch was intoxicating. And investors threw money at it. But there was a problem hiding in plain sight from the very beginning. Wirecard's actual European payment processing business was never that impressive. The real growth, on paper, always came from Asia. Specifically from a network of third-party partners in countries like India, the Philippines, and Singapore. Wirecard called them third-party acquirers, or TPAs. The story was simple: Wirecard couldn't hold banking licenses everywhere. So local partners processed payments on their behalf. Wirecard collected the profits. The partners took a fee. It sounded reasonable. It was total fiction. Here's how the fraud actually worked. Wirecard would book enormous revenues from these Asian partners. Hundreds of millions of euros flowing through entities in Dubai, Singapore, the Philippines. But almost none of that money ever flowed back to Germany. Instead, it sat in escrow accounts at third-party banks overseas. Accounts that Wirecard claimed held up to 1.9 billion euros at any given time. There was just one problem. Those accounts were controlled by Wirecard's own people. Not independent banks. Not regulators. Not auditors. Wirecard insiders. And the documents proving the money existed? Forged. Now here's where it gets maddening. People noticed. As early as 2008, internal whistleblowers raised concerns about accounting irregularities. In 2015, a report surfaced alleging outright fraud at Wirecard's Singapore office. In 2016, the Financial Times published its first critical story. Short sellers, investors who profit when a stock falls, were screaming that the numbers didn't add up. And what happened? Nothing. Worse than nothing. The German government went to war on Wirecard's behalf. See, Germany had a problem. By 2018, Wirecard had joined the DAX 30, Germany's most prestigious stock index. It had replaced a 150-year-old bank called Commerzbank. Wirecard was proof that Germany could compete in the global tech race. Politicians celebrated it. The media lionized it. And so when journalists started asking hard questions, German institutions didn't investigate Wirecard. They investigated the journalists. BaFin, Germany's financial regulator, filed a criminal complaint. Not against Wirecard. Against the short sellers betting against it. For market manipulation. Let that sink in. The financial regulator of Europe's largest economy was protecting the fraudsters, while simultaneously criminalizing the people who had found the fraud. There's a word for this kind of blind spot. Regulatory capture. When the institution meant to catch criminals starts working for them instead. And Wirecard had engineered it perfectly. Because behind the turtlenecks and the investor presentations and the DAX celebration, there was one man who actually ran the operation. A man whose name barely appeared in public. A man who, right now, is almost certainly in Moscow. His name was Jan Marsalek. And we'll get to him. But first, you need to see what this fraud looked like at its absolute peak. Because for a few years, Wirecard wasn't just fooling regulators. It was fooling the entire world. By 2018, Markus Braun was worth an estimated $3 billion. On paper. He owned nearly 7% of Wirecard's stock. He gave TED-style talks about the future of money. He appeared on magazine covers across Europe. The black turtleneck became iconic. Germany had its tech visionary. And Wirecard's market cap hit $28 billion. $28 billion. For a company whose core business was, at least partly, a spreadsheet someone had made up. The headquarters in Ascium, just outside Munich, looked the part. Glass towers. Manicured grounds. Hundreds of employees who genuinely believed in the mission. Most of Wirecard's staff had no idea what was happening at the top. They were building real products. Serving real clients. The fraud was surgical, contained to a small circle of insiders. Which made it even harder to see from the outside. Wirecard had real revenue. Real partnerships. Real technology. The fake Asian profits were layered on top of a legitimate business. Like pouring dirty water into a clean glass. And then there was Jan Marsalek. If Braun was the face, Marsalek was the engine. Chief Operating Officer. Austrian. Charming. Untraceable. He had no university degree. He had joined Wirecard at 20 years old and clawed his way to the top. By his mid-30s, he was managing billions. He flew on private jets to Singapore, Dubai, Manila, Moscow. He threw parties that lasted for days. He cultivated relationships with intelligence services across 3 continents. Multiple sources later claimed Marsalek had ties to Russian intelligence. Some investigators believe he wasn't just a fraudster. They believe Wirecard was, in part, a tool for money laundering at a geopolitical scale. That question has never been fully answered. But in 2018, none of that was public. What the public saw was a success story. Wirecard was signing deals with Visa and MasterCard. It was processing payments for some of the biggest companies in the world. It was expanding into North America, Southeast Asia, Africa. The Financial Times had published more critical stories. Wirecard sued. Analysts defended the stock. One major bank set a price target implying the stock would double again. Meanwhile, the €1.9 billion fiction was getting harder to maintain. Every year, Ernst & Young, one of the world's most prestigious audit firms, signed off on Wirecard's account. Every year, they accepted confirmation letters from a small bank in the Philippines called BDO. A bank that, it would later emerge, had never actually held those funds. The letters were fake. The signatures were forged. And EY accepted them for years. While Ernst & Young signed those letters, retired teachers in Germany were buying Wirecard stock for their savings. Small investment funds were loading up because the DAX inclusion made it seem safe. One analyst firm called it the most undervalued fintech in Europe. Wirecard's investor relations team won awards for transparency. Transparency. And all the way at the top, Braun kept delivering the vision. Digital payments would replace cash entirely. Wirecard would be the plumbing of the global economy. The stock kept climbing. The parties kept going. The escrow accounts kept growing, on paper. But somewhere in the Philippines, a paper trail was fraying. And in London, a Financial Times journalist named Dan McCrum had been staring at Wirecard's numbers for 4 years. He had been threatened. Surveilled. Accused of market manipulation. His sources had been tracked. His communications had allegedly been monitored. But he had one source who had just handed him something extraordinary. Internal Wirecard documents. Showing exactly how the fraud worked. Down to the individual transactions. McCrum published his findings in October 2019. The story was called The House of Wirecard. It laid out the entire fake TPA network in forensic detail. Wirecard stock dropped 30% in a single day. And then, astonishingly, it recovered. Because Germany still wasn't ready to believe it. BaFin investigated McCrum again. Wirecard called the reporting a malicious attack by short sellers. A law firm hired by Wirecard's own board issued a report mostly clearing the company. The stock climbed back up. But this time, something was different. Ernst & Young had a new team on the Wirecard audit. They were asking different questions. Harder questions. And one of those questions was very simple. Can you show us the actual bank statements? Not confirmation letters. Not balance summaries. The actual statements. From the actual bank. Wirecard's finance team stalled for months. Then they stalled again. And then the auditors picked up the phone. And called the bank in the Philippines directly. The call lasted less than 10 minutes. BDO Unibank in the Philippines was polite. They were helpful. They had absolutely no record of Wirecard. No accounts. No escrow funds. No relationship whatsoever. 1.9 billion euros in cash that Wirecard had reported on its balance sheet. Confirmed, in one phone call, to not exist. Ernst & Young immediately escalated. On June 18, 2020, they refused to sign off on Wirecard's 2019 accounts. For the first time in the company's history. Without that sign-off, Wirecard faced immediate loan recalls. 2 billion euros in credit lines would be pulled within days. The company had 72 hours before it was technically insolvent. Wirecard stock went into freefall. 30% down. Then 60%. Then 80%. On June 19, Markus Braun held a press conference. He stood at a podium and suggested Wirecard itself might be the victim. Victim of a massive fraud carried out by outside parties. He implied the missing money might have been stolen, from Wirecard. It was one of the most audacious deflections in corporate history. Nobody believed it. The next day, Braun resigned as CEO. 2 days after that, Wirecard filed for insolvency. The largest insolvency in German corporate history. And then Jan Marsalek disappeared. On June 19, the same day Braun was deflecting at that press conference, Marsalek boarded a private plane in Munich. He flew to Minsk, Belarus. And then he vanished. Interpol issued a red notice. Germany issued an arrest warrant. Every major intelligence service in Europe began looking for him. They are still looking. The working theory among investigators is not subtle. Marsalek had cultivated relationships with Russian intelligence for years. Multiple sources told journalists he had bragged about access to classified documents. He had allegedly shared European intelligence with Russian operatives. Some investigators believe Wirecard's fake Asian network wasn't just about padding profits. It may have been used to move money for people who needed money moved invisibly. At a government level. That investigation is still open. Jan Marsalek remains one of Europe's most wanted fugitives. On June 22, 2020, German police arrested Markus Braun at his home. He was released on €5 million bail. He was arrested again in July. This time, no bail. His trial began in December 2022. Prosecutors charged him with fraud, market manipulation, and accounting fraud. He has pleaded not guilty. The trial is expected to be one of the longest and most complex in German legal history. The forensic investigation that followed was staggering in its detail. Investigators found that the fake TPA network had been constructed with extraordinary care. Fake contracts. Fake invoices. Fake bank statements. Some of the forged documents used copy-pasted signatures from legitimate sources. Real company logos dropped onto fraudulent letterheads. The Philippine bank trustee whose name appeared on the forged documents said she had never signed anything. She had never met anyone from Wirecard. Her signature had simply been stolen. And Ernst & Young. They had audited Wirecard for 11 consecutive years. They had signed off on accounts containing this fiction, every single time. Later investigations found EY had repeatedly accepted third-party confirmations without independent verification. For over a decade. The most basic rule of auditing is, verify independently. EY had not done that. Not once. A German parliamentary inquiry later described EY's audit failures as breathtaking in their inadequacy. Meanwhile, BaFin, the regulator that had spent years targeting journalists and short sellers, was now facing questions it couldn't answer. Why had it banned short selling of Wirecard stock in 2019? Why had it filed criminal complaints against the journalists who had the story right? Why had it taken no action on multiple whistleblower reports over nearly a decade? One answer kept surfacing in parliamentary testimony. BaFin had no mandate to supervise Wirecard's core business. It could only regulate the small licensed banking subsidiary. Wirecard had structured itself specifically to avoid full regulatory oversight. A technology company that happened to have a bank attached. Not a bank that happened to use technology. That one distinction kept it out of reach. By the time the insolvency administrators finished their initial assessment, they estimated that the total loss to creditors and shareholders was over €12 billion. €12 billion. Gone. From a company whose most valuable asset had always been a lot. The investors who had bought in at the peak lost everything. The employees who had stock compensation, worthless overnight. The short sellers who had been raided by police for saying the truth. Some of them made fortunes. And Dan McCrum, the Financial Times journalist who had been surveilled, threatened, and accused of market manipulation for 4 years. He won the British Journalism Award for Financial Journalist of the Year. But winning awards doesn't give retirement savings back. It doesn't rebuild pension fund. It doesn't answer the question of where Jan Marsalek is tonight. And it doesn't explain how something this large, this obvious in retrospect, was allowed to grow for so long. That question leads somewhere uncomfortable. Because Wirecard wasn't just a fraud. It was a mirror. And what it reflected about institutions, regulators, and national pride, is something Europe is still reckoning with. When the dust settled, the numbers were brutal. Over 50,000 retail investors had held Wirecard stock. Many had bought in specifically because it was DAX listed. Because being in the DAX meant it was safe. It meant the auditors had checked. It meant the regulators were watching. It meant Germany had vouched for it. None of that was true. The insolvency administrators recovered fragments. Real assets. Real subsidiaries. Real payment technology. Wirecard's actual operating businesses were sold off piece by piece. The North American business. The Asian licenses. The European processing unit. In total, they recovered roughly €1 billion from the wreckage. Against losses that exceeded €12 billion. For every euro recovered, 12 were gone forever. Markus Braun remains in custody in Munich awaiting the conclusion of his trial. He has maintained his innocence throughout. His defense argues he was deceived by Marsalek and a small circle of insiders. That he genuinely believed the Asian business was real. Prosecutors argue he was the architect. The court has not yet decided. Jan Marsalek has not been found. Germany's response to the scandal was fast, and in some ways, remarkable. BaFin was restructured from the ground up. Its president, Felix Heufeld, resigned in January 2021. He described the Wirecard collapse as a complete disaster. That might be the understatement of the decade. New legislation, the Financial Market Integrity Strengthening Act, passed in 2021. It expanded BaFin's powers to directly supervise major fintech companies. It introduced stricter rules on how auditors rotate and report. It made it harder for companies to exist in the regulatory gap between banking law and tech law. The gap Wirecard had lived in for 20 years. The European Securities and Markets Authority launched a full review of audit standards. The Big Four accounting firms faced new scrutiny across the continent. Ernst & Young settled with Wirecard's insolvency administrator in 2022. Terms were not fully disclosed. But EY did not admit wrongdoing. An accounting firm that signed off on a fiction for 11 consecutive years did not admit wrongdoing. Dan McCrum published a book about the investigation. It was called Money Men. It became a bestseller. It was adapted into a documentary by the Financial Times. The journalists who had spent years being called fraudsters became the only people in the story who told the truth from the beginning. But here's what should keep you up at night. Wirecard didn't succeed despite the system. It succeeded because of it. It exploited audit firms that prioritized client relationships over verification. It exploited regulators who were structurally blind to the thing they needed to see. It exploited a national narrative, Germany needs a tech champion, that made scrutiny feel unpatriotic. It exploited investors who trusted a number on a balance sheet without asking who had checked it. Every single one of those vulnerabilities still exists today. Not just in Germany. Everywhere. Think about the companies you trust right now. The platforms processing your payments. The fintechs holding your savings. The auditors signing off on balance sheets you've never read. Wirecard had a real product, real employees, real offices, and real clients. And it still hid a $2 billion fiction inside that reality for nearly a decade. The short sellers who saw the truth were raided by police. The journalist who broke the story was surveilled and threatened. The regulator that should have acted went after the whistleblowers instead. In the end, the only thing that brought Wirecard down was one auditor asking one question. And one bank in the Philippines answering honestly. That is an extraordinarily thin line between a decade-long fraud and the truth. And that line only held because one person refused to stop pulling at thread. The 1.9 billion euros never existed. The DAX company was a ghost. The CEO is on trial. The COO is in the wind. And the auditors who missed it for 11 years are still in business. That is how Wirecard fooled everyone. And that is why the next one probably already has.